Hey everybody, so in this video we're going to talk about or continue talking about simplifying square roots. Remember from last time that we consider a square root simplified if there are no perfect square factors, and that's what we focused on in the previous video, and then if the radicand or the inside part of the square root is positive, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. Before we get to simplifying with negative radicands, let's go ahead and look at some definitions. Okay. Okay, so we are going to define the number I so that I squared is -1. Now we know that we don't already have a real number like this, right? Any real number, when you square it, you're going to get a positive number. So this is really a new type of number so that when we square it, we get something negative, okay? Now, what are these numbers called? Okay, multiples of this number I are called imaginary numbers. Some examples of that might be 5i, I itself is considered an imaginary number, -2i, right? I times the square root of 3. Okay, all of these things are considered imaginary numbers. Okay. There is one other type of number that involves I. Okay, so a number with the form a plus bi is called a complex number. So some examples of that, you might have 3 plus 2i. You might have something like 5 minus I. Okay. You might have something that's also an imaginary number, like 4i. Okay, or you could even have just a real number like 7. Okay, so all of these things are complex numbers. We call a the real part. Okay, and bi is the imaginary part. Okay. So now that we know what an imaginary number is and what a complex number is, let's see what that has to do with square roots, and in particular with simplifying square roots. Okay, so when we think about the definition of I, right, I squared is -1. What that means is that square root of -1 is I. Okay, and this is where we're going to come into connecting these complex numbers or these imaginary numbers with simplifying square roots. So let's look at an example. Okay, we're going to use the same technique that we used in the previous video. So we're going to split this up. I'm going to split it up into the square root of -1, right, times 9. Now square root of -1 times the square root of 9. Okay, I know that the square root of -1 is I, and that the square root of 9 is 3. Okay, now we saw in the previous part of the video about how you write imaginary numbers, right? You want to write this as 3i, right? I times 3, that's 3i. Okay, let's look at another example. We're going to go ahead and split this up again, so it's going to be -1 times 10. Okay, so square root of -1 times the square root of 10. And again, the square root of -1 is I. Now this time, 10 does not have a square root, so we're just going to leave it like square root of 10. Okay, you could write this as square root of 10I, okay, but you just have to be careful to show that the 10 is under the square root and the I is not under the square root. Okay, so either one of these forms is okay. Now let's look at another example, one that combines the stuff that we've talked about with imaginary numbers with the stuff that we talked about in the last video. Okay. Now I'm going to look to simplify this. Now I know that I have -1 as one of the factors. Okay. I also have 200, right? I know that 25 divides 200 and that that's a perfect square. So I have 25 times 8. Okay. Now 8 still has a perfect square, so I don't think this is the best way to split this up. I'm going to split this up as -1 times 100, right? A bigger perfect square times 2. Okay, we want the biggest possible perfect square that divides our number. So although 25 is a perfect square and it does divide our number, because our leftover part 8 still has a perfect square part 4, we know that we can split it up more efficiently. Okay, now I'm going to split this up. I have square root of -1, square root of 100, and the square root of 2. Okay, square root of -1 is I. The square root of 100 is 10. And the square root of 2 doesn't come out evenly, so we just leave it as square root of 2. Now, the best way to write this is probably 10i square root of 2 or 10 square root of 2 times I. Okay, so either one of those is a good form. All right. So now we've seen how to simplify square roots with positive numbers, and we've seen how to simplify square roots with negative numbers. In the last video, we'll talk about why we need to simplify these square roots and what's leading us to this. So I will see you guys there.